The Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court to clear the way for an executive order that could dramatically change mail-in voting. This all comes following a federal appeals court decision upholding an injunction on the president's federal list of eligible voters. In March, Trump signed an executive order creating that list and ordered the U.S. Postal Service to deliver mail ballots only to those on the list. 23 states sued ahead of the midterm elections, and a federal judge ruled last month that states and Congress, not the president, have the authority to set election rules. The Justice Department says it's reviewing its options, ultimately deciding that they would ask the Supreme Court to help out.
What's up, family? So, you just heard it. The Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court to clear the way for an executive order that could change how mail in voting works in this country. A federal appeals court upheld an injunction blocking it. 23 states sued, and now the Justice Department has filed an emergency appeal asking the highest court in the land to step in. And I'm going to break this down the way I always do: no agenda, no narrative, just receipts. And I want to set the frame right up front because I know how these conversations can go. So this video is not about attacking a party or a person. It's not about whether you like Donald Trump or you don't. It's about one question that everyday Americans should be able to ask without getting called names. Should unelected federal judges have the final say over how a sitting president tries to secure an election? Because the more I looked at this story, the more I realized that the actual fight and what the actual fight is happening here isn't about mail ballots. It's about who gets to decide the rules in the first place. And that's a question that goes way beyond any one president or any one court case. So let's get into the actual mechanism here because most of the coverage I've seen skips the details and goes straight to the opinions. So back in March of 2026, President Trump signed an Executive Order 1439-9, right? Or 14,399. If you want to look it up yourself. And what this order did was pretty straightforward on paper. It directed the Department of Homeland Security and the Social Security Administration to send state officials federal citizenship list so states could determine who's actually eligible to vote. And it told the U.S. Postal Service to deliver mail ballots only to people on those lists. It requires states to use secure envelopes with unique tracking barcodes, and it said the federal government would prioritize prosecution of state election officials who send or receive ballots to non-citizens or people who aren't eligible to vote. Now, pause for a second and think about that, right? What's actually being proposed here? This isn't some radical overhaul of the entire voting system. This is a verification step. And it's saying before you mail a ballot to someone, make sure that person is actually a citizen who's eligible to vote. That's it. That's the core of the order. And if you ask most Americans walking down the street whether that sounds reasonable or extreme, I think you'll get a pretty clear answer because here's what this actually looks like in real life. Imagine you're a state election official and you're about to send out thousands of mail in ballots. You want to make sure those ballots are going to people who are legally allowed to vote. That's not controversial. That's basic administration. That's the kind of thing any organization would do before sending out something important. But when the federal government tries to create a system to verify that, suddenly it becomes a constitutional crisis, right? And I want you guys to check out the article because this is from CNN. As I like to cite my sources, it says Trump's mail voting appeal tests Texas Supreme Court's anti-chaos election rule. And as it reads, President Donald Trump's emergency appeal aimed at limiting the use of mail ballots is posed to test a controversial 20-year-old Supreme Court principle that was intended to avoid chaos before elections. The Purcell principle, rooted in a 2006 Supreme Court decision, warns federal courts against making last-minute changes to voting rules, but the principle has never before been weighed in a Supreme Court case involving a federal election policy like Trump's effort to give the U.S. Postal Service and the Department of Homeland Security a hand in screening state voter rolls for potential non-citizen voters. How the 6-3 conservative majority deals with its self-created and often criticized rule in the Trump case could have practical implications for how the court handles the flood of litigation that would inevitably crash onto its docket this fall and ahead of the 2028 presidential election. And it says in quotes, Here we have potential federal agency action that could impact the way the 2026 election is run, said Chad Ennis, the vice president of the Honest Elections Project, a conservative group focused on voting policies. I think this is a novel set of facts, and how SCOTUS would apply Purcell, if at all, is an open question, right? So the 2026 election, as in the midterms for senators, you get it in regards of Republicans keeping the House, and you get the whole gist with that. So, signed in March, the president's executive order will require states to submit list of eligible voters to the U.S. Postal Service, and you get the gist, right? So that's the article for CNN. So here's where the court fight comes in. 23 states plus the District of Columbia sued to stop the order. They argue that the Constitution gives states and Congress the authority to set election rules, not the president. And a federal judge in Massachusetts agreed. The judge blocked the order and put the whole thing on hold. Then the First Circuit Court of Appeals in Boston upheld that decision. So now the Trump administration has done what any administration would do when it disagrees with a lower court ruling. They took it to the Supreme Court. The Justice Department filed a 116, sorry, family, 116 page emergency appeal. As you guys see that we just read in the CNN article a bit about the appeal, asking the justices to step in. And Solicitor General D. John Sawyer argued that the lower court's injunction was indefensible, especially because the government agencies are still uh, deliberating over how to implement the order. And the administration's argument is basically this: the courts blocked the order before the rules were even finalized. The agencies haven't even finished deciding what the final requirements look like. So, how can a court say those rules are definitely unlawful when they don't even exist yet? And that's a pretty serious question. And from a legal perspective, it's actually a narrow one, because the Supreme Court isn't being asked right now to decide whether the executive order is constitutional. They're being asked whether the lower courts jumped the gun by blocking it before the government finished writing the rules. And that's the actual question in front of them. And Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who handles emergency appeals from the First Circuit, has already ordered the plaintiff states to respond. A decision could come any day now. So, with that being said, Trump is asking the U.S. Supreme Court to allow new mail ballot restrictions in the 2026 midterms. As we read a little bit, elections are back before the U.S. Supreme Court. The Trump administration is asking the justices to quickly lift an order blocking its efforts to put new restrictions on mail in voting for the fast approaching midterm elections. It's unclear how the justices will rule, but the case focuses on a narrow question of whether or not the lower courts issued premature rulings rather than the broader questions about the legality of the executive order, which I just talked about, because the rules weren't set, but they already blocked it, right? So I'm citing this source from VoteBet in regards to this, if you guys want to check it out as we continue to read a little bit more. But as we read, but no matter what the court decides this time, a series of practical and legal challenges make it increasingly unlikely that the federal government can impose new rules, giving the U.S. Postal Service the power to block Americans from voting by mail in November's elections. As we just mentioned her name, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. A lot of people see her as a DEI judge, not a judge that was actually appointed by merit. But the justice designated to handle emergency appeals from the First U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ordered the plaintiff states to respond by Monday to the Trump administration's filing, and a decision could come anytime for that. But there are already fewer than 100 days left into the election, and the U.S. Postal Service itself said in July court filings that it is running out of time to carry out the changes the president is demanding in time for this election. The heart of the matter is President Trump's March 2026 executive order, which attempts to restrict mail-in voting by requiring creation of a series of lists of people eligible to vote, including one it requires the U.S. Postal Service to secure from states listing all voters eligible to use mail ballots. The order attempts to give the Postal Service unprecedented new power to prevent delivery of mail ballots to anyone who is not on these lists. All right. So you guys get the gist of that in this article that I just talked about. But here's the part nobody in the mainstream media is asking. And this is what I'm saying. And I want you to really sit with this question, because I think it cuts to the heart of everything. Since when did wanting to verify who's mailing in a ballot became anti-democratic? I'm serious. Think about it. If I walked into a bank and tried to cash a check without showing ID, nobody would say I'm being oppressed. They'll say I need to prove who I am. That's normal. That's how systems work. But when it comes to mail-in voting, the suggestion that we should verify citizenship before the ballot goes out is treated like some kind of authoritarian power grab. So let me ask you a different question. Who actually benefits from making it harder to verify who's voting? I'm not going to answer that for you. I want you to think about it. Because the moment you start asking that question, the whole conversation shifts. And I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying every mail-in ballot is fraudulent. I'm not saying mass voter fraud is happening in every precinct in America. What I am saying is that verification is not a bad word, and it's not a racist dog whistle. It's not a voter suppression tactic. It's a normal part of running any kind of election or any kind of system that involves giving people something of value. And when courts step in to block a verification measure, the real question isn't about left or right. It's about whether you trust the process or not. Because from my perspective, the people who are most opposed to verification are usually the people who benefit the least from it being required. And that's a conversation worth having. So it brings us to this article, Campaign Legal Center, which is the source, right? This was literally a day ago. This article was up August 3rd, 2026. 56 former judges urged Supreme Court to block Trump order that could disenfranchise mail-in voters, right? And we talked about this. Basically, they see black people, individuals like minorities, incapable to get IDs and basically calling them dumb enough where they won't be able to get one. So this right here, this article, as I gave you the receipt, because this is where it really gets really interesting. As I mentioned the date on August 3rd, 2026, 56 former state and federal judges filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court. They are urging the justices to reject the administration's attempt to revive the mail voting restrictions. And here's what I found striking about this, right? With this whole amicus brief, right? A majority of these former judges were appointed by Republican presidents or governors, or they ran for office as Republicans. So these aren't liberal activists. These aren't partisan Democrats trying to stop Trump. These are people who spent their careers in robes and courtrooms, people who understand the Constitution and the separation of powers probably better than most of us ever will. And they're arguing that Executive Order 143,099 or 14399, Executive Order, unlawfully intrudes on authority that the Constitution assigns to the states. And they're arguing that the order will force election officials to make sweeping changes just weeks before the November election. And they're saying that implementing this order now would disrupt the election in ways that would be hard to undo. The brief says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you guys can go check it out yourself at Campaign Legal Center. This is the source that I'm basically saying in my own words and breaking it down as I read it. The brief says, and I'm paraphrasing, like I said, the injury is not abstract. It's the current displacement of the state's power to create, enforce, and administer their own election rules. In other words, these judges are saying the harm is already happening. Every day the order is in place, even if it's not fully implemented yet, it's shifting the ground underneath state election officials who are trying to get ready for November. Now, I want to pause here and give you the other side of this because I'm not trying to hide anything from you. The Trump administration argues that the court blocked the order prematurely. The government's lawyers say the agencies are still drafting the rules. Nothing has been finalized. So how can a court say something is unlawful when it doesn't even exist in final form yet? That's a legitimate question. And the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals actually agreed with that argument in a separate case. And they said the legal challenges were premature, but even that court noted that there are serious questions about the lawfulness of the proposed actions if they were ever actually implemented. So you got two different appeals courts saying two different things. One says block it now, the other say wait and see. And that's exactly the kind of conflict that the Supreme Court is supposed to resolve. So when you look at that, right, you need to understand this, that this isn't a simple case of good guys versus bad guys. This is a legitimate constitutional question about the limits of executive power, the authority of states to run their own elections, and the role of the courts in checking both. All right. So I want you guys to check out this news clip and then I'll speak more to it and then eventually wrap up. And I want to get you guys' thoughts down in the comments below. Give this video a big thumbs up if you're getting value from this video, and subscribe to the channel if you're new. If you're already part of the family, I appreciate you for rocking with me.
Well, President Trump has asked the Supreme Court to allow his executive order to move forward, and that would curb mail-in voting. The president is asking the high court to make a decision months before the midterms. 23 Democratic-led states sued to stop the executive order, including Hawaii. They argue that the Constitution leaves it up to the states to run their elections, not the White House. Well, a federal district court blocked the executive order for this year's election, and a federal appeals court upheld that decision over the weekend.
So there are reasonable people on both sides of this argument, and I think that's important to acknowledge because the moment you pretend there's only one valid perspective, you stop learning. So here's what I really want you to think about. The fact that 56 former judges, most of them Republican appointees, felt the need to file a brief on this specific case tells you something. These aren't people who jump into every political fight. Former judges don't file, amicus briefs because they're bored. They do it because they believe something important is at stake. And when you have that many legal minds, people who have spent decades studying the Constitution, saying this executive order goes too far, you have to at least ask yourself whether there's some truth to that. And I'm not telling you what to think, I'm just saying. When the people who spent their whole careers interpreting the law are telling you that the law is being stretched, it's worth paying attention. And the specific concerns they raised are real. Massachusetts has already spent about $3 million on envelopes that could become completely unusable if the rule changes. Maine and Rhode Island have spent more than $50,000 on election preparations that might have to be thrown out. And that's just the beginning. So the brief warns that implementing this order could delay or invalidate ballots for military voters, overseas voters, people who register late, people who already requested their mail ballots. It's not just a legal problem, it's a practical problem. And this isn't the first time this pattern has happened. And I want you to think about the broader trend here. Over the last several years, we've seen courts step in to block or modify election-related policies from both parties. Sometimes it's Republican-led laws being blocked. Sometimes it's Democratic-led policies being challenged. A lot of individuals, most Americans would say it's more so Republican-led laws being blocked, tooth and nail. But the point isn't that one side is getting targeted. The point is that the rules around election security keep shifting depending on who's in the Oval Office and which judges are reviewing the case. And that should concern every American, regardless of party, because when the rules of an election can change through court orders and emergency appeals and last minute injunctions, people lose confidence in the system. And once you lose confidence in the system, you stop participating and you stop believing your vote matters and you stop trusting the results. And that's bad for everybody. And I'm not saying the court shouldn't check executive overreach. That's literally their job. But when the checks and balances become so routine that every election policy ends up uh, in front of a judge, you have to ask whether the system is working the way it was designed to work, or whether it's becoming something else entirely. Not to mention that illegals was on the voter rolls when they shouldn't have been on the voter rolls in the first place. But here's the thing about the Purcell principle, right? It's a legal doctrine that came out of a 2006 Supreme Court case, like I mentioned earlier, and it basically says that federal courts should avoid making last minute changes to election rules because it creates confusion and chaos. The principle is meant to protect the stability of elections, but here's what's interesting about this case. The Purcell principle has never been tested in a situation where a federal policy from the executive branch is the thing causing the last minute change. In this case, the Trump administration is the one pushing for the change, and the courts are the ones trying to stop it. So, which side is actually causing the disruption? The administration would say the courts are the ones blocking the legitimate policy. Bends on that. We've seen a lot of illegals on voter rolls and things like that within these sanctuary cities, which is a valid point. We have seen, even with this executive order being signed, like for example in New Jersey, where 6,600, maybe even more, of non-citizens being on the voter rolls since they have elected their government, and that been a governor for about a year in New Jersey. All of a sudden, she's claiming it's a glitch. But it makes me wonder as well. Let me know in the comments, since they didn't want to hand over their voter rolls to make sure eligible citizens were able to vote, and only individuals who are legal and eligible. Stopping the post office, well, using the post office to stop mail-in ballots because they cannot be verified in the states that refuse to give out voter rolls, seems like it forced their hand to be truthful. So would you call this a disruption or more so justified to push for election integrity? And it took for this to happen last minute to enforce that as Trump tried to be diplomatic and just work with the states first. Because that's what I think of my perspective, in my opinion. But let me know what you think. But the states would say the administration is the one trying to change the rules with less than 100 days to go. And the U.S. Postal Service itself has said in court filings that it's running out of time to carry out the changes the president is demanding, right? So when you look at that, right, the USPS told the court that they can't do what the president is asking them to do in time for this election. The logistics are too complicated. The deadlines are too tight, right? The systems aren't in place. An elections expert from Notre Dame Law School named Derek Mueller put it bluntly. He said, I think everyone agrees that it's not going to be implemented for 2026. The logistics are so horrific. And when the people who actually have to run the system are telling you it can't be done, that's a reality check, as they would put it. So here's where I land on this. I'm not here to tell you to go after individual judges. I'm not here to tell you the Supreme Court is corrupt or that the 56 former judges are part of a conspiracy. I'm not here to say Donald Trump is a hero or villain. And in my soul eyes, I feel as though he's more of a hero, basically trying to drain the swamp of so much corruption that have been discrediting us American voters and legal eligible citizens who came over here the right way, and just making sure that our elections are upheld in election integrity and making sure individuals are actually able to vote. Because it's mind blowing how you have some of these sanctuary cities saying, oh, well, some individuals were voting and they didn't even know they were eligible not to vote. Well, I think this justifies, our president being a hero, whether you like him or not, but just out of respect for presidency and what's happening. So, what I am going to say is that the rules around election security in this country has been shifting for a long time, depending on who's in power. And that should bother you regardless of which party you support, which is why election integrity should be upheld and the SAVE Act should be passed. Because once you accept that it's okay for courts to block election policies you don't like, you also have to accept that it's okay for courts to block policies you do like, right? So when I look at that, right, and if you're only outraged when the other side gets blocked and you don't actually care about the principle, you just care about winning. And a lot of people would say the far left has been so far left that they care about party over people, which is why this corruption have got so big. And, politicians worrying about themselves instead of actually serving the people who put them in, right? So we can look at this situation like this and say, I might not agree with what the courts are doing. You may not agree with the executive order, but you can't say the simple fact that you don't love the simple fact of verification and election integrity being upheld by our president transparently. I think this is the most transparent administration ever, right? So when you see the idea of federal judges deciding what election rules should look like 90 days before the election, um, or you might support the executive order, but also understand why states are concerned, which to me, they're more concerned because they're worrying about staying in power. Because this whole time, when you see this executive order for verification taking place, now all of a sudden it's a fight. But what happened to making sure, in the name of a glitch, like my example with Jersey, and individuals being basically on voting and they're not even eligible because there's no verification taking place when we need ID for everything else? It's kind of deceiving and also makes things very dishonest when it comes to how these judges are fighting, and very concerning to not it's very concerning to not question election integrity. But it makes you wonder, well, if the election rules always change when it benefits individuals and we can uphold verification election integrity, then that justifies that individuals only cared about staying in power and only when it benefited them. And now the verification could be the thing that keeps common ground. Then what does it? It makes you question the federal judges trying to say, oh, that the election rules 90 days before the election is a problem, right? It basically debunks and discredits the concern these states are having about changing their entire voting system in the middle of election cycle when they don't even want to give over their voter rolls. So it makes them questionable, and also makes individuals not trust the system based on their own actions, which is why this executive order is taking place through the leadership and courage, and I should say how courageous our president is being. That's my take on it. But I want to pull a scripture here because I think it fits this situation. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 17 says, "The one who states his case first seems right until the other one comes and examines him." And if you think about that, all the examination with the illegals and Jersey as an example in the name of a glitch, even though she's already elected as a voter, if anything, her being voted in as governor with illegals that were on the rolls, but she didn't want to give the voter rolls over to the president, or a federal government agency to verify to uphold election integrity, then we should make sure that her being governor is null and void, and in many other sanctuary cities or blue states. So when you examine these things, is it the federal judges trying to uphold enabling of election integrity being compromised and corrupt, or they actually working on behalf of the people? Because I think this is a justified thing of making sure this is implemented right away. Let me know your thoughts, right? But they lay out their argument, they make their case, and it sounds reasonable. And then when the other side speaks, in this case, our courageous president, you suddenly realize the picture is more complicated than you thought. That's all I'm going to say. All right? Because these former judges make their case about disruption and disenfranchisement, and that sounds compassionate or reasonable. But the truth is, we all have an ID, right? Not to mention that recently Zoran Mudami is rolling out his government-run store, and you have to have an ID just to participate and get groceries in a government-ran grocery store in the city of New York. So, look, I'm hearing both sides because in Proverbs to tell us to wait, hear both sides, examine the evidence. Don't rush to judgment because the first argument sounded good, and that's a life wisdom I want to leave with you. And looking at everything, family, I'm saying that this is rightfully so for us, the American people, that this needs to take place. I don't care how last minute it is, because at the end of the day, it basically discredits and is disrespectful to us, the people that are trying to make our voice heard in a trusted system we want to trust and making our vote count. So even in your own life, this is bigger than this. Your own disagreements and your own conflicts. Don't be the person who only hears one side, makes up their mind. Be the person who listens first and seeks understanding, examines, and wait until all the evidence, all the context is there before rendering a verdict. Right? That's the wisdom. So my question for you, do you think the Supreme Court should step in to block the executive order, or should the court stay out of it and let the states and administration figure it out? I want to hear what you think. In my opinion, I think the Supreme Court should stay out of it because diplomatically, this administration, the executive branch, our president, has been trying to work with these states who've been fighting tooth and nail, and they've been allowing illegals and using our taxpayer dollars and federal money to continue to prop them up to stay in power while discrediting our voices in the name of elections that are compromised. But I want to hear what you think. Based on everything I've seen, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm always open to possibility of being wrong. We're just having a conversation. But drop it in the comments, hit the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on post notifications, spread that peace, love, and positivity. Let the love supersede the hate, family. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.